In 2020, Joe Biden beat Donald Trump by a seemingly huge margin, 306 Electoral College votes to 232. But let me show you how shaky that lead really was. 16 of those votes in Georgia that went to Biden, look how that race went. 2.47 million to 2.46 million. That's a difference of just 11,779 votes. Meaning, if half that number, 5,890 people, switched from Biden to Trump, all 16 of those Electoral College votes would have gone to Trump as well. And this gets crazier. Arizona was similar, razor-thin margins. Biden won by 10,457 votes. So, if 5,229 of those people decided to change their mind, Trump would have taken all of Arizona's 11 Electoral College votes. Finally, look at Wisconsin. Biden won by almost 21,000 votes. If 10,342 Biden supporters changed their votes to Trump, Wisconsin's 10 Electoral College votes would have gone to Trump as well. So what's the point of this mental math? Well, if those roughly 20,000 people across 3 states changed their votes, handing Trump those 37 Electoral College votes, suddenly we end up in the absurd and almost unprecedented outcome of a perfect tie. 269 to 269. What happens in a tie? The House of Representatives decides who wins. And it gets a little complicated, but one possible outcome of that vote is that Donald Trump becomes president for a second term. All thanks to 21,461 voters in a country of more than 330 million people.
This is a map of all the counties in Michigan. There are 83 of them. And on the map, a lot of them are geographically the same size. But if you were to resize each county according to how many voters there are in each one, that would look more like this. As you might be able to tell, these 3 counties alone make up a huge part of the state's population. So the way that they vote matters a ton. So let's start here in Macomb County.
Macomb County, just north of Detroit.
Traditionally Democratic, overwhelmingly white.
Historically home to auto workers, union members.
Between 2000 and 2010, half of the manufacturing jobs in Macomb vanished.
Demographically, Macomb is very white working class. Before 2016, Macomb was a bellwether.
A bellwether, meaning it voted kind of like the rest of the country. So this chart shows how Macomb County voted for president in the years before 2016. These are years it voted for the Democrat for president. This is when it voted for the Republican, and the height is the margin of victory. And now let's do the thing where we add how the whole U.S. voted each year. And notice how closely Macomb always matches the country as a whole, the bellwether, until 2016.
2016 changes all that, and it can come down to one word, and that's Trump.
Which is right next door to Macomb County in Wayne County. The city of Detroit is about 78% black, and it typically votes between 93% and 98% Democratic. And in a place with such consistent voting patterns, it really helps to look at turnout.
Politically speaking, when Detroit shows up, it's hard for Republicans to be able to win the state.
This chart shows how many people voted in Detroit in different elections over the years. You can see that turnout in presidential elections is typically higher than turnout in midterm elections. That's true pretty much everywhere. But look at the turnout in 2016. It's almost as low as, for example, the midterm election of 2006. Now, 2 things are happening here. Detroit is getting smaller during this time. Its population is shrinking, so fewer voters. But Trump had a role here, too.
Look how much African American communities have suffered under Democratic control.
The thing that I think Trump did effectively as far as interacting with African American voters is not getting them to become Republicans or switch their vote to the Republican Party. It's to get them to not be comfortable voting for anyone.
America must reject the bigotry of Hillary Clinton, who sees communities of color only as votes, not as human beings.
Republicans don't have to move the needle that much in those communities to have an incredible impact on election outcomes.
I'm not convinced African Americans like Hillary Rodham Clinton as much as they liked Barack Obama.
No one in this race on either side has that same pull
If you don't like either side, maybe you don't vote. Now, there are, of course, other factors, too. That outcome is just one more of many that take us from blue Michigan to red Michigan. But remember, after 2016 is when Michigan starts to swing back. In 2018, the state elected a Democratic governor by a big margin. In 2020, it voted for Biden. And to see how we got there, we have to talk about white women. This chart comes from exit polls of white women in Michigan over 10 years of presidential and gubernatorial elections. And it shows us in the early 2010s, including 2016, white women in Michigan were voting more for Republicans.
In 2016, white women across urban, rural, suburban, educational level gave Trump a chance.
But after 2016, something changes. A big swing among that demographic towards Democrats. Now, this chart doesn't tell us the reason for that, but there was something big happening around that time. A kind of adjustment in the way that many women in the U.S. were participating in politics.
We will not be ignored!
Millions of people around the world marching for women's rights today.
One part of Michigan was particularly energized during this period.
The largest of all was in Washington, D.C.
Everywhere we turned, we ran into somebody from Michigan.
I'm from Huntington Woods, Michigan.
Waterford, Michigan.
Franklin. We're from Ferndale.
Huntington Woods, Waterford, Franklin, Ferndale. All in Oakland County. Women, especially white women in places like Oakland, were a big part of what drove the Democrats to their victory in 2018 and led to Trump losing the state in 2020.
I didn't think I'd ever have to worry about whether or not the president of the United States was a good role model, and I do now.
I spent every day from 2016 through now making sure I did everything that I could to make sure he's not reelected.
In some ways, Oakland is the mirror image, or maybe a 180 from Macomb County.
Oakland is the wealthiest county in Michigan and the second most well-educated. And at one time, those things made Oakland a very Republican county. But those types of voters, wealthy, well-educated, they vote differently than they once did. And you see that in exit polls, too. This one shows how college-educated voters across Michigan have voted over the past few elections. They've been trending heavily towards Democrats. You can really see the backlash to Trump in the raw voter turnout numbers in Oakland County. Turnout in 2016 was kind of unremarkable, basically in line with earlier years. But look at how many people voted in the first election after Trump won, the midterm election of 2018. Almost as many as in a presidential election. And the 2020 count was unprecedented. Okay, we finally made it to 2022. Democrats win it all. Okay, except, sorry, one more thing.
Proposal 2, the anti-gerrymandering proposal.
The state overwhelmingly passed Proposal 2.
In 2018, by a big margin, Michigan voters approved an anti-gerrymandering measure that took redistricting out of the hands of the legislature and gave it to an independent commission. Over the next 3 years, that commission would replace these maps with new maps. And the first year that these maps would be in effect was 2022. In 2022, if you added up all the elections for Michigan state representatives, Democrats won 51% of that vote. And under the new district lines, they won 56 out of 110 seats, which is 51%.
Michigan's Independent Redistricting Commission gave Michigan Democrats the opportunity to finally have maps that weren't overly biased to Republicans.
Redistricting unlocks a big part of how this happened, but there was more going on here. To really understand 2022, we have to look at these two stories. One started with the overturning of Roe v. Wade in June of 2022. In Michigan, activists responded to that by putting Proposal 3 on the ballot that year, a measure that would enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution. The measure was really popular and passed easily by more than 10 percentage points. The other big thing was something happening in the Michigan Republican Party.
By the time 2022 gets around, the Trump wing of the Republican Party had taken over entirely.
These are photos from a Stop the Steal protest at the Michigan State Capitol just after the 2020 election. By May of 2022, a poll found that a majority of Michigan Republicans supported overturning the 2020 presidential election. Among Michigan voters as a whole, though, only around a quarter agreed with that. But Republicans running for statewide office in 2022 largely endorsed that idea.
How many of you believe that the widespread election fraud was enough to swing the election toward Biden? Raise your hand with me.
That is Tudor Dixon, who Michigan Republicans nominated for governor in 2022.
The city of Detroit has been plagued with election corruption for years.
And that is Christina Caramo, the Republican who ran to be in charge of Michigan's elections. Both Dixon and Caramo would lose to Democrats by more than 10 percentage points. One place you could really see the reaction to abortion rights on the ballot and to the Republican focus on election fraud was the Michigan suburbs, which exit polls tell us had historically voted Republican until 2022. And the next year, Michigan Republicans met at their convention and they chose Christina Caramo as their new party leader.
We need to fight to secure our elections. It's the reason I did not concede after the 2022 election.
It's almost like that's all you hear from them.
It's tempting to think that Michigan is just a blue state now, but it won't take much to make it swing back. For example, Michigan is about 3% Middle Eastern North African. Doesn't sound like much, but that actually makes it the most Arab American state in the country by far, and that would be worth paying attention to if, for example, something were to happen that made Arab American support for Joe Biden go way down.
President Biden shows unwavering support for Israel, with the civilian death toll in Gaza rising.
I did vote for Joe Biden in 2020.
Do you plan to vote for him in 2024?
I do not.
Still, if we look back at some of the big moments in this story, you might notice two things. First, it's Donald Trump who's actually been the main character in Michigan politics, going back almost a decade now. And second, you probably saw some of these things happen outside of Michigan, too. This chart shows how every state voted in the most recent presidential election, 2020. If you put how the whole U.S. voted onto this chart, it would go here. And here is Michigan. In other words, by at least one measure, Michigan is the state closest to the country as a whole. Redistricting battles like Michigan's are happening all over the country. National exit polls show that college-educated Americans everywhere have been voting more Democratic, just like in Michigan, and that non-college educated Americans are doing the opposite.
That's pretty indicative of where the parties are headed. I do think that you're seeing party coalitions shift.
There's also evidence that the overturning of Roe v. Wade has been a powerful motivator everywhere, not just in Michigan, with voters rejecting abortion bans in surprising places like Kentucky, Montana, Kansas, Ohio. So, Michigan can make or break a whole national election. But there's a better reason for Americans to be watching Michigan really closely. And it's that when we do, we're looking at ourselves.